Hello and welcome back to a new video. My name is Nikolai and today we're going to talk about the transition to free trade in 19th century Europe. Today's video was written by Alexander Boyovov, Lukas Kupka, Jakub Oliera and me, Nikolai Gebhard. We're going to start this video off by first defining the characteristics of the static model that was in place before the transition to a free market. As you all know, tariffs on imports are known to raise prices of goods, which shrinks trade and consumption. At the same time, they also cause an increase in domestic production, rent and government revenues. At the same time, taxes on exports decrease prices, trade, production and rent. Nevertheless, they also increase domestic consumption and, as always, government revenues. So, in short, an increase in tariffs was to the benefit of those domestic industries which otherwise would have had to give up their monopolies, while taxes on exports were cumbersome to the producers of exports. We need to add in another factor beyond agriculture and manufacturing, that is merchants, whose goal was to maximize trade to increase turnover, on which they obviously gained a return. So, why did tariff exist? Well, to answer this question it is relevant to mention a study by Professor Jonathan Pincus, which inquires about the formation of the 1824 United States Tariff Act. In short, Pincus' ideas is that rent, namely the benefit for the domestic industries, can be seen as a collective good, which is more likely to be served if the interested parties are limited and concentrated. On the opposite, if the interested parties are diffused, each of the elements will seek to become a free rider, in Pincus' words, which means leaving the engineering of those tariffs to others. Under this idea, the movement to free trade could be explained by the supremacy of those actors whose interests would lie on removing tariffs on imports and export duties. Internationally, the beginning of free trade goes back to the 18th century with French physiocrats and the laissez-faire or laissez-passer doctrine, which was put into action in the Vergin Treaty in 1786 between France and Britain. However, the first practice of such ideas can be traced back to Tuscany in 1737 with the free export of corn. Another example is the import of grain in the 1760s while Tuscany was beset by a famine. Grain exports, however, were restricted in Tuscany due to the policy of supply, which prevented exports from the countryside to assure food for the urban population. However, it was already noted at the time that this had ill effects on investment and productivity for agriculture. The policy of supply has a significant role in the matter, as it was not only limited to food. In fact, exports were restricted on a range of materials, such as wool, coal in Britain, ashes, rags and firewood in Germany, and so on. Important to mention here is that in Britain there were further prohibitions in place for exporting machinery and the immigration of artisans. The main reason here was the belief that it would have been a gain to prevent the diffusion of this technology on the continent. Before the Napoleonic War, mercantilist states imposed high tariffs on manufacturers, except for the UK. That notably allowed free trade of wheat. This tradition was, however, abandoned by the introduction of the so-called Corn Laws in 1815. Which were part of the widespread protectionist backlash against the collapsing prices after the French wars. The imposed duties on imports of wheat were soon imitated by other continental nations. By the 1820s, wheat importing was as protected as manufacturing in most European countries. The British Corn Laws were a form of protective tariff on foreign wheat. They artificially raised prices of domestic wheat compared to foreign products, which was a conservative effort by landowners to make sure that their wheat was sold at the topmost prices. Consequently, the price of wheat went up and it enriched the land gentry at the expense of everyone else in the country. As landlords started to diversify their holding more extensively into non-agricultural ventures, such as railway shares and mining companies, their interests shifted to resemble more closely to other industrialists, who were favoring free trade. Only the people who could not diversify out of agriculture, like tenant farmers or landowners on the verge of bankruptcy, would remain advocates for protectionism. Thus, MPs who represented constituencies with a greater diversification were more likely to vote in favor of free trade than those who were representing less diversified agricultural constituencies. This theory was supported by both death duty registers and income tax returns. In the meantime, liberalism was gaining steam across the country, and liberals believed that they need free trade instead of the prevailing protectionism, since it's not concerned with the consumer nor the producer. Both liberal and radical opposition wanted lower grain prices because it meant cheaper food and lower worker fees, which have increased drastically due to the Corn Laws. During the Irish potato famine in the mid-19th century, as in some places in Ireland the population decreased as much as 30% since the population immigrated to Britain or the United States or faced simple death, politicians were faced with the question of how to keep the prices so artificially high while the local population was starving. Undoubtedly, wheat prices were an important issue for landlords and therefore politicians as well. However, consumers were also reactive to changes in wheat prices. Food riots were common in pre-industrialized Europe, and politicians had to juggle the two contrasting interests. While the Irish people were starving, Conservative Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel, who was the leader of the Tory government in the UK at the time, decided to repeal the Corn Laws. He relied on liberals and radicals in order to pass the proposition, since his own party did not back him. In the end, Parliament was willing to pass modest reforms which might have saved Britain from revolutionary upheavals that were happening across the continent at the time. Ultimately, Peel and politicians like him were willing to acknowledge the desperation of working people in their country, which led to reform and might have saved Britain from a revolution. Schoenhard Bailey argued in his book that there is a strong relation between the voters' portfolios and the Tories MP votes to repeal the Corn Laws. Quote, "In this interpretation, the repeal reflected a convergence of interests among voters, rather than the outcome of a clash between contrasting interests of the landowners and the industrialists. However, can the interest-based interpretation applied to the UK also explain the trade liberalization in Europe? According to the Italian economic history professor Giovanni Federico, unlike in the UK, the structural changes that caused the shift from agriculture to manufacturing did not occur on the continent. At the same time, the share of agriculture on GDP was still higher than the share of manufacturing in continental Europe. Since there was little evidence of a decline in agriculture in continental Europe, there was arguably no reduction in economic power of landowners, nor a shift towards other sectors of the economy, as it was the case in the United Kingdom. Therefore, the interest-based interpretation of the abolition of tariffs did not hold on the continent. Instead, some scholars argued that the voting patterns, which followed the voting rights, influenced the trade liberalization process. Suffrage was generally extended in all European countries. The resulting effect of the extended suffrage on policy depended on the preferences of the new voters. Universal suffrage is said to have caused liberalization because workers were interested in low-cost food. However, this theoretical explanation of the abolition of tariffs does not provide a fully fleshed explanation, since in many countries the extension of suffrage did not shift the power towards free traders. Industrialists often colluded with landowners to seek protection for both wheat and industrial products. In France, for example, industrialists opposed abolishing the sliding scale on wheat repeatedly until 1858, and they sometimes seemed even more interested than landowners to maintain high wheat prices. So, what caused the abolition of tariffs and the shift towards free trade in continental Europe? Well, economic research tells us that the primary cause of the protectionist policies of the 1820s was the result of falling prices of wheat, which endangered the interest of the landlords and pressed the legislative powers to raise tariffs on these commodities. However, it was shown that as soon as monopolization caused a spike in prices, the attention shifted towards the consumer side. On a broader perspective, the transition to free trade for Western countries can be explained as a general response to different causes, which were dependent on the predominant interests of the leading actors of specific countries. So, in conclusion, there were multiple reasons which led to this fundamental transition to a free trade market. And a general comparative approach can only outline a broad political and economic environment. And with that, thank you very much for watching. I hope you found that video interesting. The sources we used are, as always, on the end card.